The room held its breath as quiet dignity met a power that did not need to raise its voice. What followed was not rescue, but recognition of effort, of care, of a child watching. Some moments change nothing on the surface, and everything underneath. Stay a while. Let the silence finish what it begins. The restaurant settled into its evening rhythm, with the soft clatter of cutlery and the low hum of restrained conversation. Warm light rested on linen-covered tables, catching the edges of glassware in the polished calm of a place accustomed to being admired. He moved through it quietly, balancing plates with practiced care, shoulders squared, not with pride but with habit. Near the service station, his child sat on a small stool, legs swinging just above the floor. A coloring book lay open on their lap, crayons arranged carefully in a line. He had shown them where to sit, had explained the rules again in a low voice before the shift began. Stay here. Don't wander. If you need me, raise your hand. The child nodded with the seriousness of someone entrusted with something important. He checked on them whenever he passed, never long enough to draw attention. A glass refilled here, a plate cleared there, and then a glance just to be sure. The child looked up each time, offering a small, steady smile, the kind meant to reassure rather than ask. The table near the window had been quiet all evening. One woman, composed, unhurried, reading over the menu without urgency. She carried herself with an ease that suggested she did not need to announce anything about herself. When he approached, she met his eyes briefly, nodded, and spoke her order clearly. No elaboration, no impatience. He thanked her and moved on. The misunderstanding came later, as misunderstandings often do, without warning and without malice, only assumption. A patron at a nearby table noticed the child first. The pause in conversation spread outward, subtle but contagious. A glance became a whisper. A whisper became a look in his direction that lingered too long. He felt it before he heard anything. Years of navigating rooms that were not built with him in mind had taught him that. He straightened instinctively, set down a tray, and turned just as a voice rose, polite but edged. "Is that allowed?" The manager approached, expression carefully neutral. He listened, nodded once, then looked at the child and back at him. There was no accusation in the words that followed, only procedure, policy, concern. He answered quietly. Explained the arrangement, mentioned the sitter who had canceled, the short notice, the corner he had chosen so the child wouldn't disturb anyone. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He kept his hands still at his sides, as if sudden movement might confirm something unspoken. The child sensed the shift before understanding it. The crayons stopped moving, their eyes lifted, not searching the room but finding him. He met their gaze and gave a small nod. It was all he could offer in that moment. The word security was mentioned, not as a threat but as a solution, a way to restore order. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the calculation already beginning, how quickly he could gather his things, how to explain to the child without letting the disappointment settle too deeply. He took a breath. "Please don't call security yet," he said. The words were careful, chosen not to challenge but to ask for time. Dignity, held gently, like something that could crack if handled roughly. The room seemed to lean in, curiosity sharpening into something less kind. He kept his eyes on the manager, refusing to look anywhere else. He did not notice the woman by the window until she spoke. "Give him a moment," she said. Her voice was calm, unhurried, and it carried without effort, not loud enough to command but certain enough to settle. The manager turned toward her instinctively. Others followed. She stood, not abruptly, but with intention. When she looked at him, there was no assessment in her gaze, no weighing of worth or inconvenience, only attention. She glanced once at the child, then back to the manager. "There's no disturbance," she said. "Only a parent working." Silence followed. Not the heavy kind, but the kind that rearranges a room. The manager hesitated, then nodded, murmuring something about discretion. The word security disappeared as if it had never been spoken. He did not thank her right away. He could not. His throat was too tight, his focus too narrow. He crouched briefly beside the child, spoke softly, reassured them with a hand on their shoulder. The crayons resumed their careful work, When he straightened, she was already sitting again, menu closed, waiting. Their eyes met for a second longer than before. She inclined her head not as acknowledgement of having intervened, but as if this, too, were simply part of the evening. He returned to his duties. The room exhaled and moved on. Plates were served, conversations resumed. Yet something had shifted, quietly beneath the surface. The child watched him as he passed, eyes thoughtful now, as if storing the moment away for later understanding. He did not know what it would mean yet, only that it would matter. The following days returned him to familiar rhythms. Early mornings, the quiet negotiation of getting dressed and fed, the careful packing of a small bag with snacks and spare pencils. Work resumed with the same measured pace. Though he noticed the room more now, how glances lingered, how assumptions settled quickly and rarely lifted. He did his job well, as he always had, nothing more, nothing less. He did not expect to see her again. When she returned, it was midweek. During a slower hour when the restaurant breathed easier, he recognized her immediately, not because of how she looked, but because of the way she entered without drawing attention, yet somehow altering the air around her. She took the same table by the window. He hesitated before approaching, long enough to steady himself. This time, when he reached her, she looked up first. "I hoped you were working today," she said. There was no familiarity in her tone, no presumption. Only statement. He nodded, waited. She did not order right away. Instead, she asked about the child, whether they were well, whether the arrangement had worked out. The questions were simple, unintrusive. He answered briefly, careful not to offer more than was asked. After a pause, she said, "I'm hosting a small dinner tomorrow evening. Nothing formal. I could use help serving, if you're available." He understood immediately what she was not saying. She did not frame it as assistance. There was no mention of the other night, no gesture toward gratitude or recompense, just an invitation shaped like work. He considered the practicalities first, the hours, the location, whether the child could come. She anticipated the last question without waiting for it to form. "They're welcome," she said. "There's space, and a table." He studied her for a moment longer than courtesy required. She met his gaze evenly, unbothered by the silence. "I'll check my schedule," he said at last. "Of course," she replied, already reaching for the menu. The conversation closed as neatly as it had opened. The next evening found him standing at the edge of a quiet, well-kept home, its exterior unremarkable in a way that felt intentional. Inside, the rooms were spare, functional, lived in. No excess, no display. He noticed these things because he had learned to read spaces for what they revealed and what they concealed. She greeted them herself. No staff. No formality beyond courtesy. She showed the child where to set their things, pointed out the bathroom, the place at the table. The child accepted the space cautiously, eyes moving from room to room, absorbing tone and temperature more than objects. The work was straightforward, serving dishes, clearing plates, moving quietly among guests who spoke in low, measured voices. He remained at the periphery, attentive but unobtrusive. No one questioned his presence. No one asked about the child. Later, when the meal ended and the guests departed, she paid him promptly and thanked him without embellishment. As he gathered his things, she paused, then said, "If you're open to more work like this, let me know." There was no urgency in the offer, no expectation. He nodded. Outside, the evening air was cool. The child walked beside him, unusually quiet. After a few steps, they said, "She was nice." He considered the word. Not wrong. Just incomplete. "Yes," he said, "she was." As they continued down the street, he felt the subtle weight of something beginning, not hope, not yet, but the possibility of steadier ground. The work continued, quietly at first, an afternoon here, an evening there. Always clear expectations, always the same measured tone. He learned her routines through repetition rather than explanation. She preferred meals prepared simply. She noticed when something was out of place, but never commented unless it mattered. She arrived early and left when there was nothing more to do, not because she lacked elsewhere to be, but because she chose to stay until the end. The child adjusted more slowly. At first, they stayed close to him, choosing corners and edges, observing rather than engaging. He never pushed. He had learned not to rush trust, especially when it was not his alone to offer. Instead, he kept their routines intact. Meals at the same time, homework before anything else, quiet voices indoors, familiar boundaries inside unfamiliar walls. She accommodated without comment. A smaller table appeared in the adjacent room one evening, set low with a chair that fit the child's height. Crayons were placed neatly in a cup. No announcement accompanied it. No acknowledgement. The child noticed immediately. They tested it the way children do, sitting, standing, touching the table's edge, as if to confirm it would remain. When it did, they settled. He watched from the kitchen doorway, hands still wet from washing dishes. He felt the shift register somewhere deep, not as relief but as something steadier. The absence of vigilance. On another evening, rain arrived unexpectedly. The work finished late, the street slick and reflective. She noticed the time without looking at a clock. "You can stay until it eases," she said. "There's tea." It was not framed as permission, simply information. They sat in the living room, spaced comfortably apart. The child curled into the corner of the sofa, feet tucked beneath them, mug cradled carefully in both hands. He had warned them about spills, but they drank slowly, intent on not proving him right. The room held no sharp edges, no overwhelming statements. Books lined the shelves, many worn, some marked with slips of paper. The furniture bore the signs of use rather than display. He recognized the kind of space it was, one shaped for return. She did not ask about his past. He did not volunteer it. Conversations stayed close to the present. Work, schedules, the weather. The child listened, occasionally interjecting with observations that were met with attention rather than indulgence. Later, as they prepared to leave, the child lingered by the door. "Will we come back?" they asked him. Not her. He hesitated. Then, honestly, "I don't know yet." She heard and did not correct him. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time they stepped outside. The child reached for his hand without looking up. He took it. Over the following weeks, the space began to feel less borrowed. Not owned, never that, but reliable. A place where nothing unexpected was demanded, where no one raised their voice, where time passed without being measured too closely. The child began to move more freely, asking where things belonged, offering to help without being asked. Once they fell asleep at the small table, head resting on folded arms, crayons scattered. He went to lift them, but she shook her head gently. "Let them rest," she said. "I'll walk you out." He watched the child breathe, slow and even. Something unknotted in his chest. "Outside," she said. "You're doing well." It was not praise, just observation. He nodded. He did not trust himself to respond. That night, walking home, the child slept against his shoulder. He adjusted his grip, careful not to wake them. The streetlights passed in steady intervals. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was carrying everything alone. Time settled into patterns that did not announce themselves. Days folded into one another with the quiet certainty of routine. He arrived when expected, left when finished, and filled the spaces between with steady attention. The work shifted gradually from tasks to presence, though no one named the change. Mornings sometimes began there now. Not often. Only when schedules required it. He would arrive early, the child still half asleep, their weight leaning into him as they crossed the threshold. She would already be awake, coffee prepared, sleeves rolled back as she reviewed notes or messages at the counter. There was always a place for the child to sit, always something warm waiting. They spoke little during those mornings. The child ate slowly, waking at their own pace. He packed their bag while she reviewed the day ahead, neither interrupting the other. When it was time to leave, she walked them to the door, not as host, but as part of the morning's order. He noticed how the child responded to her presence, not with excitement, but with ease. They spoke when spoken to, listened when addressed, and gradually began to volunteer small pieces of themselves, an opinion about a book, a story about school, She received these offerings without excess reaction, as if understanding that attention was more valuable than enthusiasm. Afternoons sometimes brought him back alone. On those days, the house was quieter, the air shaped by work rather than accommodation. He learned where things were kept without being told. Learned her habits through observation. She did not correct him unless it mattered. When she did, her voice was even, precise. Trust grew not through conversation, but through repetition. One evening, the child arrived upset, shoulders tight, words clipped. He recognized the signs immediately. A hard day. Something said or not said. He knelt, spoke softly, offered reassurance. The child nodded, unconvinced. She watched from the doorway, then stepped back into the kitchen without comment. When the child finished their homework, she returned with a small bowl of sliced fruit and set it beside them. No questions followed. The child ate, slowly at first, then with more intention. Later, as he gathered his things, she said, "They don't like being rushed when they're overwhelmed." He looked at her, surprised. He had never mentioned it. She met his gaze briefly. "I noticed." That night the observation stayed with him, not because it revealed something about the child, but because it revealed something about her. Attention given without expectation. Weeks passed. The child began to ask if they would be there on certain days, began to plan small things around the assumption of return. He corrected gently, always careful not to promise what he could not guarantee. She did not intervene. She allowed him to hold that line. One afternoon, she asked him to stay after the child had fallen asleep at the small table, homework finished, head resting against a book. "There's something I need to review," she said, "if you're not in a hurry." He stayed. They sat across from each other, papers between them, discussing logistics, work, scheduling, practical matters. The conversation was sparse, efficient. When it ended, neither moved right away. In the quiet, he became aware of how still the house was, how safe it felt to remain seated. "You don't have to stay," she said, not unkindly. "I know," he replied. They sat a moment longer, then rose together. He lifted the child carefully, mindful of the way they stirred. She opened the door ahead of him, holding it without ceremony. Outside, the evening air was cool. The child shifted, murmured something unintelligible, then settled again. As he walked away, he realized something had changed, not in the shape of his life, but in its weight. It no longer pressed entirely downward. Some of it rested elsewhere now, shared without being named. He did not know yet what that would require of him, only that it was real. The change did not arrive as a declaration. It settled in quietly, noticeable only when he paused long enough to feel it. The work continued, but the edges softened. He no longer felt like a guest moving carefully through borrowed space. He felt expected. Some evenings, the child finished their homework early and wandered into the kitchen, asking if they could help. She accepted the offer with conditions, hands washed, instructions followed, no rushing. The child complied seriously, absorbing each step as if it mattered. He watched from a distance, intervening only when necessary. He had learned when to step back. She corrected gently, showed them how to hold a knife safely, how to rinse vegetables properly. When the child grew frustrated, she did not hurry them along. She waited. The child noticed that too. Later, as they ate, the child spoke more freely. About school. About things they liked and did not. About a classmate who talked too loudly. She listened, occasionally asking a question, never steering the conversation toward herself. He realized then that the child was not performing. They were not trying to be impressive or agreeable. They were simply present. That night, as he washed the dishes, she stood beside him, drying carefully. "They trust you," she said, nodding toward the other room. He glanced at her. "They trust consistency." She considered that, then nodded. "That makes sense." The acknowledgement stayed with him, not because it praised him, but because it recognized the work behind the outcome. There were moments of hesitation, too. Days when he arrived carrying something heavier than usual, his attention divided. She noticed those days as well. She did not ask what weighed on him. Instead, she adjusted, took on more without comment. shortened conversations, let silence do its work. Once, when the child was ill, he called to cancel. She paused only long enough to understand the situation. "Stay home," she said. "We'll reschedule." Later that afternoon, a message arrived. Simple. A list of suggestions, soup recipes that traveled well. A note at the end, no need to respond. The child recovered quickly. When they returned, they carried a small drawing folded carefully in their pocket. They handed it to her without explanation. She unfolded it slowly, studied it, then placed it on her desk. "Thank you," she said. The drawing stayed there. Trust grew in these small, unremarkable ways, through what was not demanded, through what was noticed and left alone. He found himself speaking more, though still carefully, mentioning a past job, a move that had not worked out. Never the full story, never the parts that still hurt to hold. She did not push. One evening, as they prepared to leave, the child lingered again. This time, they looked directly at her. "Will you be here tomorrow?" they asked. She answered without hesitation. "Yes." The certainty in her voice was not about the day. It was about presence. The child nodded, satisfied. On the walk home, the child spoke quietly. "She doesn't make things loud." He understood what they meant. He thought of the way rooms could feel crowded even when empty, of how calm could be an offering. "No," he said. "She doesn't." Later, alone, he considered the line he had been holding so carefully, the one meant to protect them both. He realized it was no longer only his to carry. The weight had shifted, not because he had let go, but because someone else had taken a portion without being asked. It frightened him, the ease of it, the way trust could form without promise or guarantee, the way attachment could grow without permission. But it also steadied him. He did not yet know what he would choose if asked to choose. He only knew that the work of trust was no longer abstract. It lived in the ordinary, in shared meals, in a drawing left on a desk, in a house that expected them to return, and that knowledge, quiet and persistent, followed him home. The question did not arrive directly. It formed slowly, in the spaces between moments, in the way certain routines began to feel assumed rather than arranged. He noticed it first in himself, in the hesitation that came when he considered opportunities elsewhere. A shift offered, a different arrangement. Things he might once have pursued without pause. Now he paused. The child sensed it before he spoke of it. They watched him more closely, noticed when he grew quiet at the table, when his attention lingered too long on nothing at all. One evening, as they packed their bag to leave, the child asked, "Are we going home or coming back tomorrow?" The question was simple. The answer was not. "I don't know yet," he said, repeating the words he had used before. This time, they felt thinner. She heard the exchange from the next room. When she joined them, she did not address it. She spoke instead of schedules, of a meeting she would be late for, of the time they should arrive next week. Normal things. Necessary things. But he noticed how carefully she avoided the future beyond what was certain. That night, walking home, the weight returned. Not the sharp, immediate kind he had known before, but something heavier for its familiarity. He had built his life around self-reliance because it was safer that way, because depending on anyone else meant risking collapse if they stepped away. Staying meant risk. The test came quietly, as most real tests do. A former colleague reached out with an offer. More hours, more stability on paper. It would mean different days, longer commutes, less flexibility. He read the message more than once, measuring what it promised against what it would cost. He did not answer right away. When he arrived the next evening, she noticed the change in him. He moved more carefully, spoke less. The child remained close, sensing tension without understanding its source. After the child fell asleep, she asked, "Is something changing?" The question was not accusatory. It was not even urgent, but it required honesty. "There might be," he said, "an opportunity." She nodded once. "Do you want it?" He considered the word want. Considered how rarely it factored into his decisions. "I don't know," he said. She accepted that. Did not press for details. did not offer alternatives. Instead, she said, "Whatever you decide, tell me before it happens." It was a boundary, spoken gently, a request rooted in respect rather than control. He nodded. "I will." The days that followed were careful ones. He maintained routines, but the ease was gone. The child noticed, grew quieter. Once, they asked if they had done something wrong. He knelt, reassured them, held them longer than usual. "No," he said, "nothing like that." But he knew they felt the shift. Children always did. The decision came one afternoon when he arrived earlier than expected. The child was already there, sitting at the small table, coloring quietly. She stood at the counter, reading through documents. The scene was unremarkable, and that was what unsettled him. This, he realized, had become normal. The cost of staying was no longer hypothetical. It was tangible. It meant tying his stability to someone else's presence. It meant trusting that what had been offered quietly would not be withdrawn just as quietly. Later, as they prepared to leave, he lingered. "There's something I should tell you," he said. She waited. He explained the offer, the hours, the changes it would require. He did not frame it as a decision already made. He did not ask her to weigh in. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she said, "I can't tell you what to choose." "I know, but I can tell you this," she continued. "If you stay, it won't be because you owe anything here." The words landed carefully. Not reassurance. Clarification. He nodded. "I wouldn't stay for that." She met his gaze. "Good." They stood in silence after that. The child stirred, sensing the stillness. He went to them, lifted them gently, adjusted their jacket. At the door, the child mumbled sleepily, "Are we coming back?" He hesitated. Then, for the first time, he said, "Yes." The word felt heavy, honest, frightening. As they stepped outside, he felt the cost settle fully into place. Staying would require him to let go of the life built entirely on his own terms. It would require trust, not just in her, but in the possibility that something steady could endure. He did not yet know if he was ready, only that he had spoken the truth. The days that followed carried a different kind of quiet. Not the settled calm he had grown used to, but something more deliberate. Each moment felt held up to the light, examined for what it asked of him. He kept his routines intact, early mornings, packed lunches, measured hours, but beneath them ran a steady awareness of choice. He did not speak of the offer again. Neither did she. The understanding between them shifted into something more careful, as if both knew that words, once spoken, would change the shape of what remained. The child continued as children do, anchored to what felt reliable. They moved easily through the house now, no longer waiting to be directed. They set their bag by the same chair each time, took their seat at the small table without hesitation. When they spoke, it was with the assurance of someone who expected to be heard. One afternoon, a delay kept him longer than planned. Meetings ran over, messages stacked up unanswered. By the time he arrived, the child had finished their homework and begun reading aloud softly to themselves. She sat nearby, working, occasionally glancing over. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She looked up. "You're here." The distinction mattered more than the apology. Later, as the evening wound down, the child grew restless, tired in the way that made them clumsy and overly sensitive. They knocked over a cup, startled themselves and froze, eyes wide. He moved instinctively, already preparing to soothe, to deflect the moment before it grew larger. She reached the child first, not quickly, just in time. She knelt, handed them a towel, and said, "It's all right. Let's clean it up." The child hesitated, then did as told. No tears followed, no shame, just resolution. He watched, something tightening in his chest, not fear this time, but recognition. She had not looked to him for permission. She had acted, confidently, as someone who belonged in the moment. That night, after the child was asleep, he remained standing near the doorway longer than usual. "I need to tell you what I've decided," he said. She closed the folder she was holding and set it aside. "All right, I'm not taking the other job." She did not respond immediately. She studied his face, as if looking for something beneath the words. "You're sure?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "But I know why I'm choosing this." She nodded once. "That matters." "I'm not asking for anything," he added. "Not security, not promises." "I know," she said. He took a breath. "I just didn't want to disappear without explaining." The word disappear lingered between them, heavier than anything else he had said. She understood it for what it was, not drama, but history. "I wouldn't have let you," she said quietly, "not without a conversation." That, more than reassurance, steadied him. They stood there, not close enough to touch, not distant either. The house held them in its familiar stillness. Somewhere down the hall, the child shifted in their sleep, then settled again. "I can't promise you ease," she said at last, "or permanence." "I don't need that," he replied. "I just need honesty." She considered him for a long moment, then said, "Then stay." It was not an invitation, not a command, simply acknowledgement of a choice already made. In the weeks that followed, nothing outwardly dramatic changed. Schedules adjusted. Responsibilities clarified. He took on more, not because he was asked, but because it felt natural to do so. She allowed it, trusting his judgment. The child noticed most of all. They asked fewer questions about where they would be, more about what they would do together. They began leaving small things behind: a book, a sweater without anxiety. One evening, as they prepared to leave, the child stopped and looked back. "Can we leave this here?" they asked, holding up a drawing. "Yes," she said. "It belongs here." The child smiled, satisfied. As they walked home, the air cool and steady. He felt the unfamiliar calm of a decision made without certainty. He had not chosen a future defined by guarantees. He had chosen presence, continuity, the willingness to remain even when nothing was assured. It was not safety in the way he once understood it, but it was real. The change revealed itself slowly, the way stability often does not through announcement, but through repetition. Mornings arrived without tension. Evenings ended without calculation. The days no longer felt like something to endure or escape, but something to move through with care. The child woke earlier now, unprompted, sitting at the table with a book while he prepared breakfast. They knew where things belonged. They knew which cup was theirs. These details mattered more than he had once understood. They were evidence of permission to exist without asking. Work continued, steady and unremarkable. He no longer measured his value by hours alone. He contributed in other ways, fixing a loose hinge, remembering appointments, walking the child to school when schedules aligned, returning afterward without rush. She noticed, as she always did, not with praise, but with trust. She stopped double-checking things she once would have handled herself. She let tasks remain undone until he addressed them, not as a test, as an allowance. The child flourished in the quiet. They laughed more easily, asked questions without fear of burden. Once they brought home a small plant from school and asked where it should go. "Wherever it gets the most light," she said. They placed it carefully near the window, tended to it daily. Evenings often ended in the same way. A shared meal, a brief discussion of the next day. The child growing tired first, yawning openly, no longer resisting rest. He tucked them in while she waited nearby, sometimes listening, sometimes reviewing notes. When he returned, the house felt complete rather than empty. One night, the child woke from a bad dream. He reached them first, as he always had. But when the child asked quietly, "Can she stay too?" he did not hesitate. She came, sat on the edge of the bed, rested a hand lightly on the blanket, said nothing unnecessary. The child calmed quickly, breathing evening out. When they fell asleep again, she remained a moment longer. In the hallway, she said, "They don't worry as much anymore." He nodded. "Neither do I." The admission surprised him. He had not planned to say it. She did not comment, but her expression softened, not into sentiment, but into understanding. There were no declarations, no redefinition of roles. What existed between them was built from days that had held together without force. from decisions made and honored, from a child who had learned, through experience rather than explanation, that this place would not disappear. One evening, as they stood at the window watching the city settle into night, the child asked, "Is this home?" He answered without thinking, "Yes." She did not correct him. The word did not require ownership. It did not ask for permanence. It described what already was a place that held them, not because it promised to, but because it had. Later, when the lights were dim and the house quiet, he sat alone for a moment longer than usual. He thought of the life he had built through necessity, of the strength it had taken, of the ways it had kept him standing. This life asked something different. Not surrender, not dependence, only presence. He turned off the light and joined the others. Outside, the city continued on, unaware. Inside, nothing extraordinary happened. And that, he realized, was the point.